Welcome, everyone. Thanks for coming today on this beautiful sunny Monday to our fifth Lunch and Learn. Today, we're going to be learning about Canadian Women's Foundation. So prior to starting, just want to recognize I'm situated here in Toronto on Indigenous land. Many of you are also located on different lands than myself, and I acknowledge those First Nations, Métis, Inuit peoples, along with the ongoing struggles in the faces of colonialism, complicated relationships, and actions required moving forward in reconciliation. So here in Toronto, the traditional lands are of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, Anishinaabe, Chippewa, and Haudenosaunee, as well as the Wendat peoples. So today we're very excited to have Sigal from the Women's Foundation, Canadian Women's Foundation, joining us. We are going to be sharing the observations of funding women, gender diverse led, and serving social purpose organizations. The Canadian Women's Foundation is a national leader in the movement for gender equality in Canada. Through funding, research, advocacy, and knowledge sharing, they work to achieve systemic change. Sigal Douale joined the Canadian Women's Foundation as Director of Investment Readiness and has over 10 years of experience in the field working with nonprofit organizations, charities, government, as well as with social enterprise and entrepreneurs. Turning over to you, Sigal. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Susanna. I hope everyone can hear me okay. I was having a bit of audio issues. Great. I think I know many folks here in the IRP kind of ecosystem since we were one of the readiness support partners in the previous round of IRP. But it's really nice to see some faces as well that I haven't been able to connect with through the second kind of iteration of this program. So my name is Sigal Douale. I'm the Senior Director for Investment Readiness and part of the Community Initiatives team here at the Canadian Women's Foundation. And so I've been really involved in both iterations of the IRP, from 1.0 to what we're calling it to 2.0 internally. And I'm hoping today to share some of the really preliminary early observations from the data that we've received from the two funding cycles that we completed. So we completed a funding cycle in the fall, and the second one just happened to wrap up in May of this year. So we're just in the midst right now of wrapping up the funding agreements and hoping to kind of launch the announcement sometime in June before folks go on summer holidays. And so I'll also share a bit some of the examples that we've seen, some of the stories that we're coming back from some of the social purpose organizations we work with, and also some of the capacity building supports. So what's kind of worked, what hasn't worked for us, and sharing a bit of that. So before we get into that, I'd love if we could do a bit of a poll. I don't know if we still can do that, Susanna.
Yes, we've got the poll here, so I'm going to launch it. I hope it works. Let me see. Launch.
So we'd love to get your feedback and just know kind of who's in the room, where your work is aligned, and if you work with women and gender diverse folks in your organizations. Yeah, I think this is really helpful for us. So it seems like many of you have very explicit initiatives, programs, and work that directly involve women and gender diverse folks. And this is important for us just to get a sense of what's happening in this ecosystem, because part of being a readiness support partner for us is also not just the funding, but building kind of that network and plugging in those that are in this program with the broader ecosystem. So that kind of a bit of mining for information on my end. So it's really helpful to know this information. Thank you. Okay, so I hope my slides are sharing properly there. There we go. Okay, super slow. So there's a few things. So I would share a little bit about kind of our approach to funding for over the 4 years of the program, the types of organizations that we're seeing and we're funding, some of the preliminary data that I spoke to earlier, and kind of our work plan around capacity building and what that really means with the two cohorts that we work with. Okay, so for our approach to funding, for us really as the Canadian Women's Foundation, the focus has been on funding communities of priority population. So that's a big key for us in terms of our criteria and who access funds. For us, that means specifically naming the groups and folks that we want to focus and target in terms of our outreach, in terms of our capacity building, and in terms of who has kind of to build awareness of the IRP. One is around First Nations, Métis, Inuit women, girls, trans, two-spirit, and non-binary people, Black women, of course, racialized women, people who are living with disabilities is a particular focus area for us, as well as, two-spirited LGBTQI folks. And so these are kind of the priority communities and populations that we've, although we fund broader than that, these are the folks that we focused on the IRP in terms of equity seeking and equity deserving groups. In terms of the industry and IR stage agnostic, investment readiness agnostic, meaning that we fund across the entire spectrum. So we are not specifically choosing organizations that are very close to being investment ready. We're very close to accessing capital. And so this was very intentional with our advisory committee and our board to choose organizations across the full spectrum. So they could be working in food security, they could be working in clean energy, they could be early stage, or they could be very close to taking on capital. And so we wanted to be very clear in terms of our approach in who receives that types of funding. I'll speak a little bit in the presentation a little bit later around our capacity building supports and the self-assessment questionnaire and some of the other pieces, some of the wraparound supports that are added on to the funding piece of the IRP. There we go. So I think many of you or some of you might be familiar with the different funding streams. So we've done a bit of a different take from IRP 1.0 to 2.0. 1.0 was focused on impact, what we call impact grants. So organizations that already have ventures and enterprises and they really want to launch and grow that or scale it. And so the feedback we received from transitioning from the first IRP to the second is that we've also added 2 new streams. So we've added a catalyst stream to really support kind of those early stage enterprises or organizations that needed one specific type of support, technical support to kind of launch them into becoming more ready to take on capital. So it could be legal supports or technical supports, hiring an architectural firm, for example. And then the systems change stream was also a new stream for us. And it's one that organizations didn't have to, they don't have to have an operating budget, a revenue budget, or have earned income. And so this stream was focused on organizations that could help build the ecosystem out and fill some of those market gaps for women and gender diverse SPOs. And so if you think of it as like the mini IRP within an IRP ecosystem. And so we wanted to create some of those resources and supports for those organizations. Although much of that IRP funding is focused on the impact stream, you'll see the 45 to 75,000 because that's where we wanted most of the funding to go to, those that are really kind of launching and growing and scaling their ventures. We did allocate a very small amount towards systems and a small amount to Catalyst as well. Okay, so this is the fun part. Who are we seeing? Who's coming in the door? Who's applying for funding? And the types of organizations we're seeing. So across the spectrum, we're getting charities, nonprofits, social enterprises, B Corps, cooperatives, and SMEs with over $1 million plus in revenue applying for funding. So it's very diverse. You have charities with 1 staff person or volunteer board, all the way up to small and medium enterprises that have multi-million dollars in revenues who are seeking funds for a very specific portion to get capital or investment, to attract investment. And so this list is really not exhaustive. There's really many ways that organizations are generating revenue. And many of them are using different models on top of each other. So for example, some are social purpose real estate organizations. Some are using kind of buy one, get one business model within their either product or service that they're developing. And some are using more the train the trainer. And so there's variations in the types of business models that they're developing and the way that they're earning income or generating revenue and profit. And then in terms of the sectors, these are kind of the top sectors we see folks working in. Affordable housing is a big one. It's of course a big issue. Trades and STEM employments for women and non-binary folks has been a big focus area. Food security and food waste, those are kind of the top 3. And then of course, I think what's interesting to point out is inclusive consumer products. We've seen a lot more gender-based analysis and gender inclusivity in terms of product design and product development for some of the SPOs. So for example, some SPOs are developing specific products for people with disabilities, right? With maybe mobility issues, assisted devices, and they're, you know, developing or manufacturing that within a community that also needs that product. And so there's a bit of a co-design that's happening as well. Okay, so generally, we've seen 5 times more funding requests than is available. That's not surprising. There's always more demand for grants or capital or funding than there is actually available. What that means is I think there's about 15.2 million in requests we received in just 9 months of the program. So we had 2 funding cycles, 15 plus million in funding requests, and a little over 3.1 million available for granting. And so there's, of course, overwhelming feedback. I think the feedback for us has been is that it isn't really a program, the IRP, but it's really like a community infrastructure piece. How do we build not only funding, but other supports and plug people into this ecosystem that is for many organizations is a little bit daunting. The other kind of learning piece or general observation has been around, it's part investment readiness, part investment awareness, and part social enterprise development. Because many of the SPOs, their most investable kind of business model for their organization has been developing, of course, a social enterprise and making sure that social enterprise generates enough revenue for them to not only be sustainable, but attract investment. And so right now we're working on a bit of a theory of change or a logic model. We've hired on an evaluation team to evaluate the program because we want them to come in and say, hey, this works, doesn't work, or if there's an IRP 3.0, this is what you should do differently. And so we're hoping that we can put together this theory of change or logic model by the end of this summer. And if we are able to share, we will share it with the team. If not, we'll share it probably at the end of the program once the evaluation is done. I think the other piece also is generally the program, what we've seen is that it's allowed women serving or women-led SPOs to really take risks. It's given them an opportunity to kind of also de-risk for investors, especially for those that are more at the later stage of their innovation or their enterprise development. And the last 2 statistics there are from our previous IRP program. And so we do surveys with all of our, with all the SPOs in the cohort. And 100% said yes, social finance will be important. That was an IRP 1.0. We'll ask the same question in this cohort. And majority said they're going to access capital in the next, 3 years or up to 10 years, which will be really important for the social finance fund and kind of the timeline of how folks are accessing capital. So there's a couple of stories here I've added to the presentation. I think I might skip over them. And that way, if folks, have any questions or would like to connect about some of the organizations we fund, we could in detail. But maybe I'll skip some of these stories and we'll go to some of the preliminary data, just given that we only have 15 minutes. Okay, can you see the data slide? All right, great. So in terms of geography, it's no surprise, but it is fairly proportionate. So what that means is in terms of the number of applications we receive versus those organizations that receive funding or receive a grant, it's proportional. So we receive the largest number of applications from Ontario. It is the most competitive by far province. It's very challenging to choose. Our advisory committee finds it very challenging to choose projects within Ontario. The second is national, and then British Columbia and Alberta are very close behind. I mean, none of that is really surprising. They have really robust, I think, social enterprise communities and also social finance, social innovation communities. What we're hoping to do is to still aim for more applicants and more outreach in provinces where we've had challenges in the last 2 cycles, which was the Yukon and Prince Edward Island. So we received applications from all the other provinces except for those 2. And so it's definitely a learning and hopefully maybe there's a way to connect with those in the ecosystem to see how we could increase some of that outreach. Okay, priority populations. In terms of populations, we see the top three as those living on low income, racialized people, and two-spirited LGBTQI+. What we did for this IRP was a little bit different. For one of the data points, we used to lump Black people and racialized people together. We separated that. And so we have data for both groups now. We've also seen a really big increase. I don't know if it's because of that data point, but we've seen an increase from Black and racialized communities in accessing the IRP funds, and also those living with disabilities. And we have amazing staff in Aaliyah and Phaedra who delve into the data a bit more. And so we have a lot of data around also the board membership. So what is the makeup of not only those who access the funds, but those that are receiving the funds? What does the intersectionality look like at that board level for them? Okay, stages of readiness. Not surprisingly, more than 2/3 are either kind of growing or launching their operations. We did see, of course, an increase in terms of the concept stage, so those that are prototyping and concepting. I think that's due, of course, to the Catalyst stream. We're active and proactive about getting organizations that a little bit early in that journey. Okay, and the types of activities. So where is the funding going? What does investment readiness really mean to them at a practical level? Like, what are they implementing? And so the top three, we've surveyed those that applied for funding and also those that receive funding. And so in terms of services and activities, business planning, without a doubt, is number one. Fine tuning kind of the revenue streams, which is also part of business planning. Teams and skills development, what that means is owning in on their financial kind of and investment acumen. And not surprisingly, investment measurement and management was the third one. So not only measuring impact, but also communicating impact to investors and how you do that. Oh, one thing to also point out for this is that SPOs can select more than one option. So we encourage them to select 3, because what that does is that it helps us build out the capacity building component of the program for us. We don't want to create workshops and webinars that are kind of a waste of time for those that are in the program. And so we survey them to understand really what is it that you need from the program? How can we better help you? What kind of support do you need to kind of add value to the funding? And I think one of the feedbacks we received is that they need a lot of help in directing them to the right or appropriate services. So the service providers, the service provisions, what aligns with their mission and their mandate and who they are as an organization. And the second is the types of capacity building supports that they would want out of the program. So very quickly, when will they access social finance? Again, I think in less than a year. We asked this at the beginning and we'll ask this again at the end. But I think this timeline is really, it doesn't really capture the nuances to this question when we have conversations. They usually adjust this to about 2 to 5 year timeline. We asked this question also in the interim report and the final report. And we have amazing staff in Aaliyah and Phaedra who have one-on-one calls, periodic calls with all of the SPOs to check in on them and to see if there's any supports that they need and kind of where they are on that journey, if they need to pivot. And this question is usually asked, and some of the other questions are asked as well. And then the final report, we ask folks to do a self-assessment questionnaire, which is about 55 questions, pretty gnarly, very huge. It's a self-assessment to say, well, what does investment readiness mean to you as an organization? How do you define that? And it helps us get a better picture of how ready do they see themselves in accessing capital, especially for charities and nonprofits that we work with. Okay, there's 2 more slides, the second last one. This is a lovely kind of map that we got from ESDC, which is kind of the new language, plain language around the different stages of investment readiness. So the 4 stages of readiness around the 5 kind of bucket areas, as we're calling them. And so we took this and we essentially shared it with the cohorts to try to understand which buckets or which kind of those squares really we could add value to, or where do they want to focus their attention on. Okay, and the last slide. Here we go. So what we did is we just superimposed different types of activities based on that journey of kind of investment readiness. So for example, if you look under business plan development, so it's the second kind of bucket in green. And then if you look at stage 2, we have financial readiness. So the feedback we received is that they want to learn more about, as an organization, how do you become more financially ready, or increase kind of the capacity of the teammates in the team so that their financial literacy goes up. And so we partnered with organization like Finance Cafe. We did like I think a 1 month or 2 month deep dive. Founders, SMEs, and the heads of the organization had to commit 2 or 3 hours per week. And the goal was to understand kind of that short and long-term financial obligations, the role of revenue, the role of cash flow, the role of budgets, and different types of sourcing for business financing. And essentially, it was a bit of a mini financial literacy program. And so you could see in each of these kind of squares, we're hoping over the next year to develop some workshops and webinars or deep dive training sessions based on that feedback. And so I think we've done about 30% so far. And so we're hoping by the end of the program to deliver some more sessions. Okay, I'll stop there because I realize we only have 7 more minutes.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Sagad. That was really helpful and really informative. I especially liked how that last piece where you had superimposed the systems that you created on top of those capacity building supports and that journey of investment readiness. I'm going to open the floor if there's any questions that anybody wants to ask right away. I know we don't have a super lot of time, but we definitely want to make space so that we can ensure that we have enough time to be able to answer some. And maybe I can kick it off if no one else has a question right away. I'm interested, I mean, you went through like a little bit about the differences between IRP 1.0 and IRP 2.0 for sure. Have you seen a difference in not only just, I suppose, like the different streams that you've created there, but I'm interested in like how the team has seen things change over that period of time. Like, have you, any other insights you can share about like how you've approached it when you've got different kinds of organizations that have applied? Oh, we have another question here too. Yeah. Oh yeah, can you share the email? Oh, by email, can you share the presentation? If you could send that to Marisol.
Sure, yeah, absolutely. We'll send the present. It's only in English, it's not in French, so we'll share that though. I think the big piece for us has been the funding is great, but organizations need more than funding to really grow and scale their ventures. And one of the biggest learnings for us from IRP 1.1 to 1.0 to 2.0 was that in 1.0, we lacked a little bit in terms of connecting SPOs directly with investors or with those that are deploying capital. So there was a bit of a disconnect. So they'd received the grant, but they didn't have face-to-face one-on-one time with capital deployers. And so we're hoping through this version of the IRP that not only they have access to investors, but also investors learn what's happening on the ground with grassroots organizations so that they could build also their education piece around what does it mean, for example, to have gender lens investing in their portfolio? What does it mean to create social finance tools and instruments that work for community and not kind of against community? And so it's an education piece for them, but it's also, by them, I mean investors, but it's also a way for community to have a reciprocal relationship with investors as well. So it's not just a one-way transactional piece, right? Like we want to access your funding or your capital. Well, then you need to kind of jump through hoops to create a pitch deck that meets this and X and Y parameter. That's not necessarily the type of program that we want to build and type of connection we want to build between some of the SPOs that we're funding and how they kind of interact with investors. And so we're very mindful about that relationship.
Thank you so much for that. That's really helpful and really helps to be able to show that difference between, oh, here's funding in certain ways, but like, no, we actually care and we really want you to have a say in how this shapes up for you, specifically for that demand side for the SPOs. Yes, Dan.
Yes, thank you. I'm just wondering, great presentation. I'm just wondering if, as part of the conversation, were the entities that got funding and did the stats, was it explored if they were just looking to use that business plan to get funding from traditional grant-making bodies, or are they really in the mindset of investing dollars? Because that's something we've found both with Co-op World and elsewhere. But people are saying, oh well, I needed a business plan. I got a great business plan. Now I can just go to my usual my usual foundation funders, and so just curious if that was discussed.
That's a really great question, Dan. I'm also going to steal that question for future meetings if I have that, because it's true. We did in IRP 1.0, we did receive some of that. Some organizations kind of were developing the business plan so that they could kind of use that. I mean, it makes sense, right? To use that to philanthropic funders and to get more grant dollars. But we're pretty adamant that the point of the business plan, the business model, and we reiterated and emphasized it many times, is to put them on a pathway of investment readiness. So we really focused on capital. We were focused on, repayable finance. And part of it was emphasizing it through our language, emphasizing it through the requirements in our one-to-one conversations, is that this is very different from a grant program. We were very adamant about that. And there was a bit of education piece that happened in 1.0 IRP versus now, that this grant program is not to get further grant dollars. That could be one objective, but really it's to put you on a pathway to explore taking on capital, which for charities and nonprofits is very scary for some folks who even have the staff or the capacity to do it. Still very scary. And there's still a bit of a risk, right? Imagine Canada came up with their report a couple of years ago, and it's pretty much the same. Like 2/3 of charities and nonprofits are not familiar with some of the language and are a bit risk averse in terms of taking on capital loans. As Julia's nodding, yes, it's absolutely still the same numbers. But to your question, Dan, one example is Salal is a rape crisis center in BC, and they were taking that route, developing a business plan for the sake of developing one, and they could shop it around. So we said no. They asked for our feedback for some consultants they could work with on developing it. We said Scale Collaborative out in BC is great. They are focused on multiple revenue sources for organizations. And today, Salal won the bid out of 25 organizations for the city of Vancouver to have a nominal lease for their facility. So they beat out all these for-profits. The city of Vancouver invested in them. A rape crisis center, which built an investment case, a business case, to have the property in downtown Vancouver for a lease of $1, I think. So it happens, but I think those conversations need to be had.
Thank you so much. I realize that we are at time, but there is one more question we have from Rosa. So I will just say, if anyone does need to jump off right away, feel free to do that. Sigal, do you have another 2 minutes to be able to answer Rosa's question?
Sure, yeah.
Fantastic, thank you. The question I have here, and Rosa, feel free to unmute to explore further if you'd like to, but among your CWF activities, where is GBV included? This is a major problem among Indigenous women entrepreneurs.
Yeah, that's a great question. GBV is included, I think, in the types of organizations we fund. So if the question is about IRP, I'll answer in 2 ways. There's that IRP, GBV is included in the types of organizations we fund who are doing work in GBV. So for example, there's one organization that's developing an app around this particular area. She worked in a rape crisis center in Toronto and decided to create this app because there was a shortage of very easy, accessible ways for people to access frontline services because they're navigating through many different doors and ways. And so she's developing an app. Yes, gender-based violence. Thank you, Marisol. So one way is through the organizations we fund. Another way is being mindful about the community spaces we develop in the IRP. So if we hold peer-to-peer sessions which we do hold them every about 2 months, where we gather the whole cohort together. It's an opportunity to network and to learn what each are doing, is to talk about that in that space as well. We have a document called Creating Safe Spaces, Brave Spaces, to make sure that the space is meeting kind of the needs of all the organizations. And then outside of the IRP, within CWF, gender-based violence is essentially that is really the core mandate of the Canadian Women's Foundation. We are for 30 years a gender justice, gender equality organization. Most of our funding and most of our work is based on gender-based violence. In Canada, sexual violence is the only one that is not declining. Out of all the G20 countries, sexual violence in Canada has not been on the decline. And it's very unfortunate. And so there's a lot of work that happens within CWF around gender-based violence. We created the Signal for Help, campaign that's been kind of went viral around the world for people who are experiencing intimate partner violence and all types of gender-based violence. So that's really kind of the focus of CWF. The IRP is a little bit far removed from that. We're one program within that whole organization.
That's great. Thank you so much. This has been really informative, very jam-packed and everything that we needed. So thank you so much for joining today. Thank you, Sigal and Marisol. Yeah, we'll see you next time.
Thank you everyone for having us, and thank you for eating lunch with me.
Take care.
Thanks for organizing this.
Yes.
This is so great.
Thanks,
Thanks, Leah.
Yeah.
Bye.
Bye.